Good morning, everyone. Trust you all keeping well. Can I just get an indication if the sound is coming through clear? Okay. Okay, perfect. My name is Tanusha Singh. I'm leading the Occupational Health Outbreak Response Team at the NIOH. A very warm welcome to you on behalf of the National Health Laboratory Services and the National Institute for Occupational Health. Before I continue, I just want to extend a sincere apology to many of you who tried to log on to the session on Tuesday, but unfortunately we maxed out at 1,000 participants, which is the capacity we have for Zoom. And so we'd like to thank you if you were one of those people. Thank you for joining us again today. We really appreciate it. We are constrained in terms of the license, but our sessions are recorded. Tuesday's session was recorded and today's session is recorded as well, so it is available on our website. And so if you have if you're struggling to log on, or if there's colleagues that wanted to still log on today and is unable to do so, they can still get the information from our website. So thank you. And our session today is Return to Work, and it covers two aspects. The one is what to do with a positive worker, and the second, what to do post-lockdown. And our presenters are going to unpack the various issues in terms of medical surveillance, fitness for work, etc., and to deal with this very complex and evolving situation that we find ourselves in. And we are also uncertain in terms of lockdown, what's going to happen tonight. We're waiting for the President's address to the nation. And then we are planning to do a question and answer session, possibly in a week's time, covering also some of the critical issues, depending on what the announcement is going to be this evening. In terms of sessions that's upcoming for next week, actually tomorrow we have the environmental health practitioner session. Next week we're going to possibly have a session for the food industry. And then we're going to also have a step-by-step risk assessment for, planning on the risk approach for when workers return back post-lockdown. And an invitation will be sent to all participants on our database. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for your patience and understanding in terms of our Zoom link. And I hand you over to our program director, who will take you through today's program. And over to you, Ashraf.
Thank you very much. And that was our head, as mentioned, of the National Institute's COVID-19 outbreak response team, as well as the head of immunology section, Dr. Tanusha Singh. Thanks for that, Tanusha. So very briefly, just to introduce you to those two slides that Glenn is going to just quickly put up for us. The NIOH, that is us, the National Institute for Occupational Health, is part of the National Health Laboratory Services. We are the Occupational Health Specialized Division. The NICD is the Public Health and Clinical section with regard to the laboratory and testing. So the NHLS is the largest diagnostic pathology service in Africa. I think it's important to know that it's a public entity as well, providing an essential service to the bulk of our population. That's over 80%, as you notice, at 0.2. And it supports not just the National Department of Health, broadly speaking, but also specifically in the area of COVID-19 aspects through the NICD and the NIOH, as well as supporting the provincial offices of the Department of Health. It has over 7,515 employees that serves in over 356 labs, over 260 sites nationally. And that's a very important resource that is available through public funding, through taxpayers' funding that is available, supporting the bulk of our population. The capacity around diagnostic tests is over 30,000 plus. And the sister unit that we have is the National Institute of Communicable Diseases, who's playing a key role in providing clinical and support at a national level around COVID-19. We are the National Institute for Occupational Health. Glenn, if we can go to the next slide. We have the NIH itself providing a number of key services, and the Zoom session is not just around the teaching and training, but there's specialized services and support, as well as knowledge generation and advisory services. It's key later on, we will have all the contact numbers and email addresses and so on. And I'm now going to ask my colleague to step into the room. The program, thank you very much, Craig. The program we have is exactly a duplication of what we did on Tuesday, but because of having had more than 1,000 attempts for people to log on, we're now almost reaching, we are definitely over 900 logins already for this session. So the next part after Tanusha's welcome is the return to work and workplace preparedness by Dr. Mpumi Ndaba. She'll be up next. She's already ready for that. Cleaning and decontamination is another colleague, Onika Dikaledi Matuka. And then that's followed by Dr. Odette Volming, dealing with medical surveillance and fitness for duty for workers. The mental health aspect is going to be dealt with by Dr. Spoor Halamono, apologies, by Dr. Mpumi Ndaba. And then the compensation aspect is going to be dealt with by Dr. Samantha Yalu. All of our colleagues are either from the occupational medicine section of NIH or from the immunology or other support section. I now hand over to Dr. Mpumi Ndaba. Thanks for
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this. Good morning and welcome to today's session on return to work. I'm going to be starting with a COVID-19 update as today. My colleague Ashraf has alluded to the 2 slides. And by the way, I'm Dr. Mpumi Ndaba from the occupational medicine section. I believe I've been introduced. And my first slide, I'm going to quickly appraise people on the sources available on our websites that they can check for latest information on COVID. And the current status, like the global infections are at 2 million, slightly above 2.5 million. We have 183,000 plus deaths as of 22 April yesterday. In the South African context, we've got 3,635 positively identified infections, and we're sitting at about 65 deaths as at the 22nd of April. We've heard about the transmission, and we know about the 1 to 2 meters, the danger zone, and we know transmission is through direct contact and droplet transmission, mainly through coughing and sneezing, which generate droplets, and we know that larger droplets, they fall to the ground within a 1 to 2 meter radius of the person and within a few seconds. We've heard about the the persistence of COVID-19 on different surfaces. Just of note, the virus has a very fragile outer membrane and it's less stable in the environment, can be killed by simple disinfectant. The survival time in the environment depends on the pH of the environment or where the virus would sit on, the size, the inoculum size, the dryness of the area, temperature in the environment, exposure to disinfectant, and the type of the surface. So below at the right end of the slide, there's an indication of the lifespan of coronavirus on different surfaces. Some of the workplace preparedness measures, or what we could be starting to think about, would be anticipated number of staff that would be returning back when we're opening up services. When are we opening up, and what services are going to be open? Is it going to be employee only, especially in areas where the spaces are shared between employees and the public? The risk assessment that we have done that looks at the potential increased risk of transmission based on the operations in that area, the activities, the specific activities, and of utmost important is the shared spaces. This is the shared spaces amongst employees, be it the bathrooms, be it the tea areas, or some of the waiting areas that employees share generally, or shared spaces between the employees and the public. So some of the people will be returning to our workplaces. Some of the people have already been in the workplace, but some workplaces have been closed. So we'll be getting people coming to the workplace from lockdown, following lockdown, and some people will be coming, although it's from lockdown, but from isolation. Some people will be coming in from quarantine. And we also have a few people that will be coming back to the workplace, either from sick leave, from leave, or from maternity leave. And all these people will be converging into the workplace at the same time. So these are the dilemmas and these are the situations that we need to think about as workplace people or as planners in the workplace to try and ensure that we minimize or mitigate the risk of transmission in the workplace. Some of the workplace changes that we've spoken about so far and considerations include engineering controls, which can be whether we've reviewed or improved ventilation, whether we're going to encourage more or allow natural ventilation or mechanical ventilation. But now all these changes we probably made before everyone came back. And we need to be sure that these are going to be working and effective as people come back. Some of the controls include administrative controls, which will involve what we're going to be advocating to people, and substitution not really applicable, and PPE we know as the last resort. In some other instances, we will need to look at PPE. Is there any PPE measures that can be implemented? And some of the already communicated controls or means of minimizing transmission include social distancing, more office space, and we need to start even consider, can we have other people working off-site or maybe in another environment, or even open up bigger spaces? And also some of the workplace facilities we need to review in terms of how people are seated there, how people are gather around those areas. And of utmost importance is access control for staff coming back to work, for visitors who might be coming in. And is there a dedicated or streamlined or controlled access into our work facilities? So some of the non-medical management preparations include, we should be able to debrief people of the new changes. Yes, we've made plans, but we should be able to actually advise people before the lockdown is uplifted. We need to think about psychosocial support, new work organization, because obviously there'll be new ways of doing our work, and access control, and then also the special arrangements that we refer to. And also of utmost importance is cleaning, disinfection. Yes, we were cleaning, but we need to review now, how are we going to change our cleaning and disinfection procedures? So some of the training and awareness that we need to conduct to our staff, we need to sensitize skeleton staff, especially the ones who are still working during the lockdown, because there will be changes. So when we implement changes, we're not only implementing for people coming back who are not around, even people who are around need to know what will change as other people come back. We need to be starting to communicate to staff at home. We need key operational people in various points to be aware of the changes. For example, HR, because a lot of people will be coming to us about leave, what happens here, and who do I go for? So those key people with regards to operations need to be sensitized, they need to be trained on how to manage different situations that will be brought to our attention. So some of the procedures to be followed, these need to be marked clearly and they need to be communicated so that people know what to do and where, and also to minimize traffic to the key operational people. We need to review the procedures, and while we remember that this is a public health outbreak, some of the issues of confidentiality might not necessarily apply. For example, if you've been diagnosed, you need to inform your supervisor. But in normal situations, we know that we don't necessarily inform supervisors of our health conditions. But these are things that we need to train people on and make sure people are aware of these changes. And of utmost importance, we need to continue to train and communicate health promotion messages. We know some of the health promotion messages and preventive messages include washing your hands, the cough etiquette, respiratory etiquette, avoiding close contact, and also encourage people to stay at home where they're in. And some of the focus now on mitigation of risk in the workplace, some of the key considerations, especially around primary prevention. This is where we're trying to minimize or mitigate the risk of people being transmitted in the workplace. Health risk assessment, we have done them. We've spoken about engineering, administrative, and PPE. Some of the controls that have been in place, we need to really look into those if we haven't. But also some of the considerations need to be around how do we ensure that there's business continuity, at the same time incorporate pandemic preparedness and policies that are affected here and there. Education and training, as I've alluded on my previous slide, and risk communication, in this instance in the form of health promotion. We also need to emphasize that we communicate the screening and means in which we're going to identify potentially affected employees, where employees also need to know that they need to limit contact and movement within the workplace. But of utmost importance is the issue of social distancing. How do we make changes about social distancing and the rest of the other health promotion messages? So some of the workplace practices that we need to review in a specific environment or specific workplaces include mass gatherings. So we think about the water, the coffee stations, the common areas, the bathrooms, waiting areas where people traditionally would have to come back via the clinics or via the medicals. Think of the meeting forums. Can we use other platforms for meeting or other means of having meetings? Or even within a meeting, can we try and maintain the distance between people participating in a meeting? And other specific procedures pertaining to the workplace include spirometry. We need to consider the method and assess risk. Is it really safe to do that at this time? Breathalyzers, the safety and risk, and some of the biometric or access control material, and signing in where there's common material for signing in. And of utmost importance, again, let's remember the public spaces. We can train our workers, but where it's public spaces, we might need to have extra means of making the public aware of how we want our workplaces to be handled. So from the medical management part of the return to work, we will be talking, my colleagues will be talking to workplace cleaning and disinfection protocols, medical fitness issues and return to work, mental health issues, and then impairment and compensation issues, but also include work restrictions. So just as a way of emphasis, we have an info at nrh.ac.za portal where if you have any queries over and above being able to field your queries today after this presentation, you can field your questions there. But also there's a 24-hour NIOH hotline, which is meant by doctors. It's 24 hours, it's doctors who are going to advise you, but it's specifically for workplace queries and workplace issues. So the number is 0800 212 132. The number 0800 212 132. You can check me on this. You can dial the number now without flooding the hotline. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And our next presenter will be dealing with the cleaning and decontamination. Is Annika available? Okay, thanks. Glenn will be doing the presentation via the video. So that's Annika Dikelele-Matuka, who's dealing with cleaning and decontamination. It is critical for us to prepare, for all of you in the workplaces to prepare the question of the sanitization of the workplace before the return of your employees, as well as whilst people are continuing to work. So we ready, Glenn? Okay, so there's one question that came up now in the chat box. Where do people find the resources? Please go to the website. On our front page, you will find it. You must scroll down because there's lots of resources. The videos and presentations are there, and you just need to look for the return to work presentation. And then a reminder for those who require CPD points, please include in the chat box, not to all the other attendees, but only to the panelists. There is a selection that says panelists only and not the panelists and attendees. Please send your professional registration number to us for CPD points. And then for the HPCSA people, we will be sending you the multiple choice questionnaire after the session for completion and resubmission. Thank you very much, Glenn. So we're now going to look at the presentation from Annika Matuka, Cleaning and Decontamination. On screen there? Okay, apologies for that. We're going to pause that presentation. For that particular section, I'm going to recommend that you go to the session we had on Tuesday, and in that session, early on in the video recording and as well as the actual presentation, you'll find that on our website. I'm now going to move on to the next section dealing with medical surveillance and fitness for duty for workers. This is critical for those workers who have been in lockdown or working from home or self-isolating or in quarantine, and when they return back to the workplace, my colleague from the occupational medicine section, Dr. Odette Volmink, is going to do that for us. Glenn is just putting up the slide. So as a reminder again, please, the chat box at the bottom is where you are going to, welcome, is going to put your questions for this presentations. So I'm handing over to Dr. Odette Volmink, who's going to do that presentation. Thanks, Odette.
Hi, good morning, everybody, and thank you for your attention and for coming in this morning. My name is Odette. I'm from the occupational medicine section, and today we're going to be speaking about the medical surveillance and the fitness for duty in this time of COVID-19. So with regards to hazardous biological agents regulation, which kind of guides which is a regulation under the Occupational Health and Safety Act that guides what we do in workplaces with regards to risk assessments and then the controls, including medical surveillance controls. It defines, I think in terms of COVID, it is a group 4 hazardous biological agent, which means that this agent can cause severe human disease and is a serious hazard to exposed persons, and it can present a high risk of spreading in the community, and there's no effective prophylaxis and no effective treatments currently available. So the scope of this regulation, it applies when a hazardous biological agent is either deliberately produced or processed or used, handled, stored, or transported. So in the case of laboratory workers, in the case of healthcare workers, this applies, but it also includes and governs where there may not be deliberate intention to work with the hazardous biological agent, but it may result in persons being exposed to this agent during their performance in the workplace. Okay. So what is medical surveillance? This is just to recap because I know most of us know what this is. The medical surveillance sort of describes an activity that targets the health changes in employees after being exposed to a hazard. And there are many different types of surveillance, but the medical screening is actually often part of the surveillance program, and it's used to detect early signs of work-related illnesses by oftentimes administering tests that can include questionnaires, physical examinations, as well as medical examinations. Medical surveillance, just to reiterate, is a secondary prevention strategy. And I know my colleague spoke first about the primary prevention strategies. So it acts behind the implementation of engineering controls, administrative, including work practice controls and PPE, in terms of in the hierarchy of controls for a hazard in the workplace. And it often also can be used as a mechanism to determine whether these primary prevention strategies in the hierarchy of controls are effective or not, or are they causing early disease in people. There are many elements to a medical surveillance program, and normally the first thing to do is to identify the groups of workers for which medical surveillance is actually necessary. It can also include an initial medical examination where you collect either medical and occupational histories, and then goes on to do periodical examinations or testing at regularly scheduled intervals. It also comes into play post an incident where medical screening may be necessary, often uncontrolled increase in exposure where there is a spill in the case of chemicals and things, but also in COVID where there is an employee who is come in to be COVID positive. There also needs to, with regards to medical surveillance, ongoing data analysis of the information that's collected, and it's imperative to have worker training as part of the program so that employees are able to recognize the symptoms of the health symptoms of an exposure. A written protocol needs to be in place, and appropriate record keeping needs to be done. This is also in line with the legislation. And employers need to have actions in response to when identification of a potential hazard and risks and health effects occur in the workplace. So just by recapping, in the line with COVID-19 risk, always medical surveillance is risk-based and not a blanket for everybody. And as per the legislation is determined at the guidance of the occupational medicine practitioner. And the purpose of this is also for early detection of infected employees. With regards to COVID-19, these employees need to be detected so that they can be removed and isolated, and they can have early referral for treatment, for care, so that they can also come back to work. There can be a timeliest return to work. Also, it allows to prevent spread to the other unaffected staff and the consumers, the visitors, or the clients of the business. So this is allowed by the prompt identification, isolation, quarantining when necessary, doing contact tracing to follow up the other people that may have been in contact, and having effective return to work practices and workplace restrictions where this is needed following a case. Sorry, Glenn, can I ask you just to move this slide? Yes. Okay, so Mpumi spoke a little bit about how can COVID-19 risk come into our workplaces. And our workers stay in a community, and as we know, there is community exposure to COVID-19. And so within the community, people can be exposed and then bring the exposure to the workplace. Or within the workplace, either from colleagues, or even from the work processes that are done, you can have workplace or occupationally acquired exposure to COVID-19. So who are the workers that are at most risk for getting workplace or occupationally acquired COVID-19? And this we know that the healthcare workers, the emergency response and public safety workers, people who deal with post-mortems, laboratory workers, airline operators, but we also need to think about retail workers who are exposed in the community or in the public that they serve, border protection and transport security workers, and maybe even drivers who drive passengers, correctional facility workers, solid waste and water management workers, environmental health workers, and even repair workers who come into homes in the public. And people who within their jobs, I know that currently there's a ban on travel, but as these things are lifted, people who travel to high-risk places are also at risk of occupationally acquired COVID-19 in their workplace. So as we said, the first thing to do when we're thinking about medical surveillance is that we need to think about who are the at-risk categories. And we spoke a little bit about the worker categories, but even within these worker populations, people do different tasks. And so even within these, there's a different risk categories in these populations. So high-risk workers are workers who have frequent or close contact within 2 meters of people who are known to be COVID positive, or they have unprotected contact with infectious secretions of individuals who are COVID-19 infected. And these include healthcare workers, laboratory workers, mortuary workers. Within this group, there's even a higher risk group where we know that aerosol generating procedures make the risk even higher for these workers. So they also need to be thought about. So it's important to look at the tasks that our workers are doing. With regards to medium risk, we have to look at these people who have frequent, close contact with people who either may or may not have been infected with the SARS coronavirus 2. And these often include people who may come into close contact with the general public. These are your airline staff, your retail staff, your border protection, your public transport industry, correctional facilities operations. And then the lower risk category of workers are those that actually don't require to be in contact with people generally that could either be suspected of being infected with COVID-19. And often these categories of workers don't frequently have contact with the general public. So once the risk is assessed, we need to look at different kinds of medical surveillance tools that can be used for COVID-19. And there's different things that can be used, and it would be on what was appropriate in your setting in terms of what kind of system that you would put into place. The first system that they speak of is self-monitoring, where the employees monitor themselves for fever by taking their temperature maybe twice a day. They look for symptoms of COVID-19, which can include fever, cough, shortness of breath, sore throat, myalgia, malaise. And they should be provided, if we are employing this mechanism, these employees need to be provided with a plan for who are they going to contact should they develop symptoms or develop a fever. Then another type of tool to use is active monitoring, where there's a regular communication with that potentially exposed employee to actually physically assess them for the presence of fever and symptoms. And this is often used for employees with a high exposure risk in the workplace. And in this system, you need to communicate at least once a day with these employees. And this can be either delegated to the occupational health or the infection control program. Then we can get a combination of these two mechanisms where it is self-monitoring with delegated supervision. And here the employee performs the self-monitoring with oversight by either the occupational health or the infection control program. And particularly on days when the employees are scheduled to work, the facilities would actually consider measuring the temperature and assessing for the symptoms prior to starting work. This is just but an example of a screening tool that can be used. This comes from the guidelines for essential workers from the National Department of Health. And here it looks at if there's any evidence of fever, also measuring temperature, and looks at all the symptoms that someone could possibly present with if they are infected. Here they are asked to monitor their symptoms in the morning and in the evening, well, at least twice a day. And this goes on for 14 days post-exposure. So the types of screening that we can use a symptom questionnaire, as we saw in the previous slide. We can also use temperature screening, but caution must be, we must be cautious when we're using temperature screening alone, just because oftentimes fever is measured at temperatures above 38 degrees Celsius, and the fevers may also be intermittent and not present in some patients like the elderly, those that are immunosuppressed, or even taking certain medications for, to limit their fever, like non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So clinical judgment should be used to guide the testing of patients in such situations. And medical evaluations may actually be recommended for people who present with slightly elevated temperatures but below 38 degrees Celsius. Or even in the case of people who present only with certain symptoms like muscle aches, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, runny nose, loss of taste, smell, or fatigue, which are not kind of the more common symptoms, but can also be seen with COVID-19 infection. And maybe these people need to be screened, but assessed by the OMP to see whether testing is actually necessary. So we said that medical surveillance is risk-based. So in terms of our categories, in terms of the high-risk patients, particularly the very high-risk patients, we do need to think about active monitoring, where they look for fever and symptoms consistent with COVID-19. And these people should then be isolated while they are monitored, because they're of the high-risk category. People who are in the medium risk need to maybe could consider self-monitoring up until 14 days after the last potential exposure. And they also need to check their temperature maybe twice a day and remain alert for symptoms. And if they are afebrile, if they are asymptomatic, they are not restricted from work. But also they need to be ensured that they are asymptomatic and afebrile either before leaving home or before reporting to duty. The guys who are at low risk, and there's no identifiable risk category, they actually don't really require monitoring and restrictions from work. So basically our recommended procedure is, firstly, within our work population, we need to determine the risk of COVID-19 to our employees. We then need to have a screening program that we institute, where we screen for COVID-related symptoms and report symptoms to a designated person, either occupational health practitioner or the infection control practitioner. And oftentimes a good practice is at the start and the end of the shift to have a designated person checking the employees to see whether they have a sudden onset of the symptoms. Employees should know that they should report if any symptoms occur, and these employees should immediately be provided with a surgical mask and be referred to the designated staff at the workplace so that arrangements can be made for testing. And in the case where employees report additional symptoms, as the ones that were outlined in this monitoring sheet, this is particularly for essential workers, but these symptoms that like body pains, redness of eyes, loss of smell, loss of taste, nausea, fatigue, these patients should also be provided with a surgical mask and maybe referred to the occupational health clinic, or if there's no such thing in the workplace, to the family practitioner or the primary care clinic for further evaluation and to see if testing is actually indicated. And on receiving the results of the employee, the health professional should notify the workplace ideally so that the employee can be managed. If there's a delay in achieving the results, these need to be actively followed up to prevent delays so that the next steps can be actioned. Where someone becomes positive, we need to notify the NICD as it's a notifiable disease and do contact tracing. The workplace needs to also have certain protocols that need to be tailor-made and organization-specific. And these kind of protocols need to include, if in the event of a symptomatic person coming to the workplace, where are they referred for testing and treatment? In the event of a positive employee in the workplace who is now identified to be positive, what are the procedures that follow with regards to isolation, contact tracing? They also need to think about return to work protocols for an employee who is infected now coming back to the workplace, and when is this relevant? And is there restrictions that need to be placed in the workplace following return to work? Okay. So these are examples of workplace management algorithms that sort of tackle different kinds of scenarios. Now, just looking at scenario one. Scenario one involves a worker with a positive COVID-19 test in the workplace. So he's been tested, symptomatic tested, and now found to be positive. This worker needs to be placed on sick leave. We also need to think about disinfection of the workspace, if it's applicable. And this case needs to be reported. We need to ensure that it's reported to the NICD. And if relevant, if it's an occupationally acquired infection, we need to also ensure that reporting happens to the Department of Employment and Labour. This person's contacts need to be traced within the workplace as well as outside of the workplace. And this person needs to be self-isolated in their home. And once they are better and non-symptomatic, we need to think about when do we actually return them to the workplace. In the case of mild symptoms, the guidance has been that the employee can return to the workplace 14 days after the symptoms onset. But in the case of severe symptoms, we need to re-look at this, and 14 days may not be enough. And so one of the guidance has been that people return to work 14 days after clinical stability. So once they've had a severe case of COVID-19, but once their symptoms have resolved, 14 days after that resolution, they can return to the workplace. Okay, so that's scenario one in a worker where there's a positive COVID-19 case. We're now going to look at an algorithm, management algorithm for scenario two. And scenario two involves a worker who has acute respiratory infective symptoms. Okay. So we've screened these workers. They do present with symptoms. We then need to assess the validity of the symptoms, and this should be done by a health professional. And then if these symptoms, we agree that they are acute respiratory infection symptoms and could be suggestive of a COVID or a SARS coronavirus, testing is essential for them. If the health professional feels that they actually don't qualify, their symptoms actually don't qualify as a person under investigation, they should take usual sick leave, be diagnosed with whatever they're diagnosed with, and return to work appropriate for the diagnosis they have. The patients who are referred for testing for SARS coronavirus 2, if these cases come back negative, they should also follow the usual sick leave procedures where they offer sick leave, they get better, and then they come back to work in the appropriate time for the diagnosis that they have. For patients who are tested for SARS coronavirus 2 and then become positive, they then go on to scenario 1 and are placed on sick leave, reported, contact traced, isolated, and then we need to think about return to work appropriately. Okay. So now I'm just going to talk to a few other algorithms for people who are exposed, for COVID-19 exposed workers. So when there's two scenarios that we're going to talk to. A scenario, firstly, the first thing that we're going to do when we know someone is exposed in the workplace is that we need to look at the risk of exposure to this worker. High-risk exposures are often where there's close contact, usually within 1 meter, for about more than 15 minutes, to a worker where there's no PPE in place for the worker who's been exposed, or there's been a failure of PPE, a mask that is broken, or there's been direct contact of that worker with respiratory secretions from a known positive person. So that is scenario 3, where there's a high risk and a confirmed exposure, and now the worker is now presenting asymptomatic but is having a high risk of exposure. Firstly, the line manager should assess the risk and confirm if the risk is high. And in these cases where the risk is high, there needs to be approved self-quarantine for these employees from the management. And these patients, because they have contact within the NICD guidelines, there needs to be a report of the staff to the NICD. And these people need to be self-quarantined at home, ideally for a period of 7 days, where they're doing, ideally for a period of 14 days, where they are daily looking at their symptoms, checking for symptoms of COVID, as well as doing temperature checks. And then, if these people are asymptomatic, we need to think about when can they be returned into the workplace. Ideally, they should be returned if they are well following 14 days. But as resources and staff shortages become an issue, there has been guidance that maybe we need to evaluate an asymptomatic individual after exposure. On day 8, post-exposure, they should have a testing done. And if this testing is PCR testing done, if this testing is negative and there are staff shortages, they can be considered to come back into the workplace. If these workers who have a high risk of exposure within the workplace develop symptoms during their self-quarantine, these people need to go through to scenario 2, where their symptoms are assessed. If they need testing, they go on for testing, and their results have the appropriate follow-up. So now we're going to talk to scenario 4, which looks at an employee in the workplace who has been exposed to a known COVID-19 exposure or suspected, but there's a low risk. Low risks are things like it's been more than 1 meter away from the worker, or they've been exposed for maybe less than 15 minutes, or they were within 1 meter, but they were wearing the appropriate PPE. They are considered to be low risk, or even if the patient was wearing a surgical mask to control their respiratory droplets, they would be considered to be lower risk. And here the line manager needs to assess the risk. And so for low risk exposure or contact with a suspected COVID-19 case, the person can continue to work but needs to self-monitor for at least 14 days. If this person is a suspected case, the person who the employee was exposed to, maybe a patient, was a suspected case, it is the line manager or the occupational health needs to try to get the results urgently for the case to see whether sort of quarantine isolation is appropriate. Okay. And if the index case is negative, no more self-monitoring actually needs to be done. But if in the case where the COVID-19 is a positive patient, but the person wore the appropriate PPE, they need to continue to symptom monitor for the full 14 days. And if they do develop symptoms, we go back to scenario 2, where their symptoms are assessed. If they require testing, they then go on to testing, and appropriate follow-up is done. So with regards to now, when does the employee or an infected employee now be able to come back into the workplace? There's 2 strategies that they speak of. There's one that's a test-based strategy, which basically says that the employees can return to the workplace when there's resolution of their fever without using any medication, and there's an improvement of their respiratory symptoms, and there's a negative test from at least 2 consecutive swabs collected more than 24 hours apart. But we can also, in the time of shortages of tests, we can also use a non-test-based strategy to say when can employees come back into the workplace. And with regards to non-test-based strategy is when all their symptoms have resolved and the employee's 14 days have passed since the onset of symptoms. Okay, so on return to work, all employees after isolation or quarantine should follow the general work restrictions that include undergoing a medical surveillance to confirm that they are fit to work, wearing surgical masks at all times while at work for at least a period of 21 days from their initial test, implementing social distancing, hand hygiene, respiratory hygiene, cough etiquette. They should continue to self-monitor for symptoms and seek medical reevaluation if respiratory symptoms recur or are worsening. And in the case of healthcare workers, it's important for these healthcare workers who were positive on return to work, they should avoid contact with severely immunocompromised patients. Now, just touching briefly on fitness for work. Fitness for work is medical assessments that are done to determine medically if the employee can perform the job or task under the working conditions that are experienced at the time. And it takes into account the job specifications of the employee and the risks posed to that employee. And this needs to be done when there's significant change in workplace conditions. So oftentimes in the era of COVID, now there's a new hazard that's been introduced. When there's a medical condition that can have severe outcomes due to the level of exposure of COVID-19 by the job, and when an employee is maybe returning to work post-infection from COVID-19. So just the UK government put out some guidelines on who is kind of severely immunocompromised and maybe needs to be given consideration in the workplace when we're looking at their fitness for work. And those, the severely immunocompromised, have been like the solid organ transplants, recipients, cancer patients who are undergoing active chemo, lung cancer patients who are undergoing radical radiotherapy, cancers of the blood or bone marrow, people who are having immunotherapy or other continuing antibody treatments for cancer, those that are having targeted cancer treatments that can affect the immune system, those who have had bone marrow stem cell transplants in the last 6 months and maybe are still taking immunosuppressive drugs, the workers with severe respiratory conditions, rare conditions, inborn errors of metabolism that would affect their risk of infections, people are on immunosuppressive therapies that significantly increase their risk of infections, and maybe women who are pregnant with significant heart disease, congenital or acquired, have very low immune systems and we need to think about these cases with regards to fitness for work in high-risk situations. Excuse me. Other vulnerable people, we know that workers who are over the age of 60 have cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory conditions, chronic renal failures, maybe even pregnant workers or employees on immunosuppressive therapy like systemic corticosteroids, or HIV diagnosed workers who are virally suppressed. Maybe these need to be thought of on a case-by-case basis, looking at the level of disease control and severity to see whether or not they are fit to work, particularly in situations where there's high risk. Now, this is just briefly where, these are the ideal situations, and sometimes we don't have situations that are ideal, but there are some guidance, particularly from CDC, where different return to work strategies are done according to the resources available. And these are some of the things that have been done in other countries, particularly with regards to workplaces. In facilities, have considered local testing availability and the facilities' availability to maintain staffing levels when deciding on the strategy. And those cases where the testing was limited, testing needed to be rationed to maybe more symptomatic people, the facilities have used a non-test-based strategy to determine who comes back to work. In situations of critical staff shortages, some places have conferred with their local public health authorities where infected healthcare workers were allowed to return to work in earlier circumstances than would be ideal. But these, in terms of critical staff shortages, had to be determined on a case-by-case basis, considering duty restrictions in these healthcare workers, where maybe they could only care for COVID-19 patients or either non-patient activities. Okay. In settings where community transmission was really high, and they felt that devoting the resources to contact tracing and risk assessments would divert from other important infection prevention and control activities. In these cases, in these scenarios, other countries reinforce the need for the standard precautions for all patient encounters. They stress the importance of hand hygiene, cough etiquette, and respiratory hygiene. They enforce social distancing between healthcare workers and patients. And they instructed all health workers to report any recognized exposures and have staff regularly self-monitor for fever and symptoms, and reminded staff to avoid reporting to work if they were ill. And then where resources then became available, ensure that staff wear medical masks at all times as a protective measure to limit spread. So those are just some considerations in resource-limited situations, and these were some things that have been done in other countries, but specifically for healthcare workers where staff shortages were a critical resource that they couldn't afford. Okay. So thank you for your time and for your attention. These are just some inquiries. If you have any inquiries, please use our hotline, as Dr. Ndaba said, but also there's an email. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was Dr. Odette Valming. I'm going to immediately ask my colleague Glenn if he's ready with the video. Otherwise, I'm going to quickly proceed to Dr. Ndaba to proceed with the next one. Glenn? Okay, so we are going to quickly replay that video for you. And this time we have sorted out the sound matter for you. A reminder, in the chat box at the bottom, please add your questions there. And there's another reminder for those who require CPD points, particularly for the HPCSA, please privately, not to all attendees, only to all panelists, send me your the CBD number, your professional number. If you're ready, Glenn, we can proceed. This is the topic of cleaning and decontamination by Anika Matuka-Tikelele.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to present to you cleaning and decontamination procedures, which forms the critical component of infection prevention and control in keeping our environment clean, as well as protecting our workers in the workplace. So we need to differentiate between the two terminologies. We have cleaning, which is removal of foreign materials from objects using water with detergents or soap, but it does not kill the virus. Although the decontamination is a process which will kill the virus, and that should be done only after cleaning has been performed using the relevant disinfectants or chemicals. So the use of correct disinfectants is important in reducing or preventing the spread of COVID-19. Disinfectants may not work on all surfaces because you get different surfaces. You get the porous surfaces, you get semi-porous surfaces, then you get the non-porous surfaces. The disinfectants are likely to work best on non-porous surfaces. And then for other surfaces, you may need other alternatives, such as your surface disinfection devices, and as well as your sterilants or washing machines, which you can use for the laundry with soap or detergent and warm water. Some disinfectants can be toxic, so following safety procedures is important. I will cover the safety measures in the next slides, and then they can also be expensive. So whoever is going to use the disinfectants must make sure that they discuss this with their procurement department in order to budget for this chemicals, so that we have adequate supply in the workplaces when we go back, or even now for those who are at work. So the World Health Organization and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention recommend that appropriate disinfectants with proven activity against envelope viruses, such as your coronavirus, be used to minimize the risk of transmission of the disease. And such chemicals must contain active ingredients, either as a single ingredient, some will come combined in a chemical or the disinfectant to be used. And those include your hypochlorite solutions, which is commonly known as bleach or jig. Then you get your alcohols, which should at least be 60%, but preferably 70%, as you know that the higher the concentration, the better you are able to inactivate your microorganisms. Then you get your hydrogen peroxide, you get phenols, as well as quaternary ammonium compounds. So you get different types of disinfectants. You get those that clean the surface and those for the hand, which we use for sanitizers. So for surface, you get the liquids, which can come either ready-made or ready to use, or which needs to be diluted. So you need to follow manufacturer instructions in this regard. Then you get the powders, which need to be diluted to form a concentration that you need to disinfect. And the frequently touched surfaces should be disinfected regularly. So those include your shared equipment, as well as your doorknobs, the toilet seats, because we share toilets, and as well as your personal items, such as your desks or your computers, your phones, landlines, your bed rails for those in hospitals, as well as iPads that are used for those that are isolated, or even in office environment or any other workplace. And then for hands, You get the antimicrobial soaps, you can get liquids as well as gels or wipes. So the hands should be cleaned at the entrances or at the doors, and also at regular intervals. The regular intervals will depend on what activities you use, but it's mainly before either you touch a surface, or you touch your food, or you handle a patient in hospital cases, or even after blowing your nose or going from the restrooms and so forth. So the sanitizers must be allowed to dry before any activity can take place, and it doesn't require any rinsing when you're using the gel type. So the most important thing also is to follow proper hand wash techniques. We know the most important 5 moments of washing, which is wetting your hands, lathering, and scrubbing, rinsing, and as well as making sure your hands are dry after washing. So the effectiveness of disinfectants depends on several factors. Those are your concentration that is required, as I've mentioned. You need to follow either the product label or the MSDS, which will guide you on what concentration should be made or prepared for the disinfectants. Some of them will come ready to use, and they will mention the percentage effectiveness on the containers, such as your 99.9%. So you'll know more or less the effectiveness of that chemical. And whereas some will tell you how much volume, for example, 2 ml, that's needed if you're using the gel sanitizer, for example. So the ingredients is also important. As I've mentioned, the active ingredients on the first slide, that should be considered for the coronaviruses. There are many products in the market, and just ensure that you get those that can target the virus, because some will only indicate bacteria, but we are not sure if effectiveness has been tested against the virus. So storage of products also is important. As the higher the temperature, the higher the germicidal activity. So it must be stored properly also, as temperature can also sometimes degrade the microbicidal activity of the product. Relative humidity influences activity of gaseous disinfectants. Those are, for example, your ethylene dioxide that can be used to sterilize in the room. Then you get your pH, which can increase antimicrobial activity of certain ingredients such as your quaternary ammonium compounds, but can reduce the activity of phenols. So pH has to also be taken into consideration, as well as the contact time. The contact time is the time it takes for the disinfectant to remain on the surface and to be able to kill the virus. You'll see on the next slide, I'm going to show you examples of different products with different contact times. And the container also will give you more or less the information on the compliance of which standard they followed when they prepared the disinfectants. So that has to be looked at. It will either also be on the material safety data sheet, or it will be on the product label. So there are certain safety measures to consider when using cleaning agents and disinfectants. I've mentioned material data safety sheets, which is important because it gives you information about the product that you'll be using. It includes your safety measures, includes the composition, includes the emergency procedures which to follow, and where there is a spill, what to do. So that has the critical information. The user must make sure they familiarize themselves with the material data safety sheet before they even start using the chemicals. So they must follow the product label and the instructions on the label. And after using the disinfectants, they must make sure they wash their hands properly and also moisturize hands to prevent skin irritation, as some chemicals can cause skin irritation. So where disinfectants are used, there should be adequate ventilation in that room, either in the form of natural ventilation, of open windows, supplementing it with a fan which will help in air mixing, or if there is mechanical ventilation in place, that can be used as well. And most importantly, the users or the cleaners should be properly trained, and they must be provided with personal protective equipment, the relevant ones for using the chemical. And the employees must be encouraged to report potential exposure as soon as possible so that they can get help or medical help on time. So this is a list of EPA-approved disinfectants. You will find it on the EPA website that's shown at the bottom, right at the bottom of the slide there. There's a whole lot of lists. I've just extracted a small portion of that. But just to show you that there are different active ingredients, as I've mentioned, the quaternary ammonium, the phenolic compounds as well. You can see from the slides, those have the same contact time, and then you get sodium hypochlorite, that's your bleach, that has a 1 minute contact time. Then you get your hydrogen peroxide, which have the 5 minute contact time. So depending on your activity and how fast your procedures are, like in emergency cases, like in your ICUs, you want to use disinfectant with a shorter contact time so that the work can carry on. So these are just examples of products that you find. I just wanted here to show that, as I've mentioned, that the product label will give you information. You see this product has got 70% alcohol, and then it shows the expiry date, the shelf life of 2 years, whereas this one here right at the bottom didn't have an expiry date. So it's important to look at the expiry date, because that determines the microbicidal activity and how stable the product can be. If you use it beyond expiry date, it might not kill the virus. So you'll be decontaminating, but there won't be any effectiveness. So check the products as I've mentioned. It will say it's killing 99.9%, but this was tested against bacteria, and on its label shows, it actually mentioned the type of bacteria that it was tested against. So you will not want to use this for the virus if you are not sure of effectiveness of the product. So they either come undiluted, as I've said, and then just to mention that what I've just said now, check if it's antiviral, because you cannot interchange, they are not interchangeable. You cannot use a disinfectant for bacteria for the virus if it has not been proven to be effective against the virus. And then it will tell you the amount of how much to use. For example, one will say 1 pump is equivalent for 3 meals, and then the contact time, it will state also. But as mentioned, this one didn't have either the expiry date or the percentage alcohol wasn't indicated. So this is just an example of MSDS. This is showing you the recommended use for the chemical or the product. So for your cleaners, they must be trained that each chemical must be used for a specific purpose, because you find out that sometimes in the workplace, the cleaner seems to just take any container and use it maybe for floor cleaning, whereas that's for something else. So they must be trained properly before they apply the disinfectant. And then it will show you the chemical nature of the product, whether it's flammable or not. There's a safety precaution, and then it will tell you also the category where the chemical is being classified. So I'm sure you have seen this on TV recently, where a hospital in Limpopo was being deep cleaned, using, I'm not sure if it was a mist or gas, but you can see here the droplets coming out of the instrument. So it must be taken into consideration before doing cleaning. Check the supplier. This cleaning process was done by a reputable company which has been in the field for a long time and is experienced in cleaning. So there will be some suppliers, just ensure that they are registered suppliers and they are reputable. So also discuss the method of cleaning with the supplier prior to disinfecting, and then the contractor must also provide the effectiveness report of the chemicals that they are using in killing the virus, and then they must tell you of the procedure to be used. You must take into consideration also the types of surfaces, because as some procedures may not be aligned to the type of surfaces you have. Like for example, the hood, you don't want the hood to get wet while cleaning. If you have dry walls also, it's made of material that is not impervious. And then the CDC recommends the 28-hour waiting period before cleaning for those areas with high capacity, such as your schools or your centers and so on. However, some information for hospitals is that in ordinary rooms, the room can be cleaned immediately after the patient has left, but in aerosol generating procedures where it's conducted, then there must be 1 hour waiting period for areas with 6 air changes per hour, and then those with negative pressure or 12 air changes per hour, the waiting period is 30 minutes before it can be cleaned. And the workers must make sure they have signage on the door for those rooms that has been that are going to be cleaned during the waiting time, and then only remove the signage when it's ready for clean and can inform other people or the workers that the room is being cleaned. And adequate ventilation must also be ensured in those rooms while waiting, so that it helps to clear out the air, and the areas must be closed off before cleaning. So where to from here as you prepare to go back to work? You need to first review company risk assessment for COVID-19. You may have the existing risk assessment report already, but if you haven't included COVID-19, this is time to include it. Check what existing measures do you have in place and whether you need additional controls in place. In the next week, we're going to cover full-on risk assessment on what control measures to follow and how to conduct risk assessment. And there are also slides on our website, the NIOH website, of the previous risk assessments that has been done for you to get more information on that. So employer must also ensure adequate supply of washing facilities where people can do their hand washing, as well as the cleaning materials, which include your detergents and disinfectants for healthy hygiene practices, as well as hand sanitizers, which should be accessible at the critical areas, at the main entrances of all the departments, at, for example, your lifts, which are shared by people, and at your changing rooms, and so on. So based on your risk assessment, you'll identify those areas and make sure you have the hand sanitizers, especially where water is not accessible. That's where you should have sanitizers. And then dedicated PPE for all areas, because cleaning PPE shouldn't be moved around, because we want to minimize cross-contamination to other areas. And the manufacturer instruction must be followed. And for those cleaners that are using reusable gloves, it is recommended that extra pairs of those gloves are allocated in the case where they need to disinfect. After cleaning, they need to soak those reusable gloves in a disinfectant, and they need to make sure the gloves are dry before they use it. So in case they are not properly dried, they can have an extra pair to use in the meantime. And then the next step is also to update your policies, your standard operating procedures, as well as your work instructions that you have in place. Those that should include procurement, review your contractors, and if possible, let them bring the samples to the workplace so that you see there's a product you would like to use, and then also supply you with the information related to the products. Check what control measures you have in place, and then the application of those disinfectants, check if they're being used properly. The facility manager must ensure they supervise the cleaners to see that they are applying proper PPE and using the chemicals properly, and that disposal is done properly also, and then how to manage spills in the workplace. Also review that and include it in all your procedures. Ensure that your training program is in place and that all workers are trained, those that are cleaning and as well as normal staff who's in the workplace, so that they know of their risks and then on how to protect themselves. Also health promotion campaigns in order to remind people of the danger of this virus, as well as inform them of information, new information, as we know that this virus is evolving and there's more information coming in. So they need to be updated on the information. Then on your risk assessment, you're going to identify your hotspots and make sure you prioritize the high risk areas, not neglecting the other areas, but just making sure that you follow the hierarchy of controls and you minimize the risk as far as possible. And then I've just listed the recommended sites where you can get extra information. There's a whole lot of information on the WHO and CDC website. The EPA website, I've mentioned, it has the list of approved disinfectants. You can go through it and check which chemicals you think you can use for different surfaces that we have mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annika. That is Annika. So thank you. That was the section on the cleaning and decontamination, which Annika had presented for us. And now I'm going to hand over directly again to Phumi, Dr. Ndaba, who's going to deal with the aspect of mental health and the support required by employees. Thanks.
Greetings once again. I've introduced myself before. We're going to be talking briefly on mental health issues. This is not a detailed session, but just awareness for us in the workplace. So at this time, we are aware that there's a whole lot of mental health issues. There's a whole lot of anxiety that people are facing. Some of the psychosocial stressors, especially in the South African context, include the lockdown itself. People are a bit stressed. How am I going to live, or how to live with COVID-19? Returning to work, am I going to be exposed at work? How do I return to work? How will that happen? How will the phased-in approach happen? Is it safe? So different psychosocial status, happen to different people because of the different stages of the pandemic. So some of the stages that have been defined, this is a guidance or document that was actually developed by psychiatrists, a group of psychiatrists teamed up together in the UK. It's got different stages of the pandemic and what technical capacity is required for that. So basically it tells us about our preparedness and the mental well-being and also the functioning relating to us responding to the pandemic. So there are basically 6 stages of this pandemic. Usually there is a preparation phase right at the beginning where we're planning, we're anticipating what if it comes to the country or earlier on, and then gaining insights and information on the practical preparation for the pandemic. And then also at that time, that's the time where, the simulation is encouraged. People need to practice what if, it comes to us and so forth. The second phase is the early phase where each country starts to have single small number of cases. There's also potential for fast shifting case loads. And at this stage, still full technical capacity. People are doing what they've been doing and what they're supposed to be doing. There's also vigilance regarding sufficient resources. And at this stage, you start seeing people, some ethical dilemmas. What if, what are the boundaries and so forth. Then the third phase is the mid phase where there are many new cases daily. And there's also strain on the technical capacity. And this is where we believe we are at in South Africa. And the next phase would be the peak phase. We really don't believe that we've reached the peak phase, but we could be wrong. And then the next phase would be the tail-off phase and the post-COVID phase. Of significance is that the tail-off phase and the post-COVID-19 phase, the timeline is not known as yet. So what are some of the staff challenges during the mid-phase that we are at? As we know, a lot of us are anxious. There is high levels of distress and worry. Some of us are already not coping. They're already overwhelmed. Already some people who are working from home who are already away. They're habituated to the new normal. There's some overdrive, but then some people are already starting to deplete their personal reserves, and others are running on empty. But others, even though they have some of these psychosocial sort of issues or worries, they're trying to stay strong for patients or for co-workers in the workplace. And then also there's also potential fear, of reprisal relating to difficult decisions. Because remember that we're having this for the first time, so we're not sure what is the right decision or right response that we should be following. So some of the staff own actions, that this is the time that people should focus on their own circle of influence, supportive teamwork. People want to deal with the familiar. And then also people need to start also practicing and developing their own psychosocial or cognitive strategies, and also make conscious attempts to establish a routine. This is very important that during this time, despite the disturbance, people need to start establishing their routine of relaxation, sleep hygiene, and when do you take breaks and so forth. And also that people should be encouraged as well to avoid excessive alcohol. But what are some other recommended interventions? These include prioritize healthy food, healthy drinks, rehydrate a lot during this time, rest, sleep, and people should eat around this time as well. Also, people need strategic comfort breaks incorporated in their daily activities. And from managers or senior corporate, there has to be active monitoring of staff well-being. There have to be mechanisms where staff well-being is constantly monitored. And then also it has to be standing agenda on all management meetings. COVID-19 has to be there. And there has to be regular communication channels where we are as an organization, what's the status now, what are the new changes, and also of importance as we share, the communication, as we share other activities and changes, it's very important that we ensure that successes are shared, because people can do with some positive stimulation at this time and also encouragement. So no matter how small some of the positive successes, they need to be shared. But while we stay also vigilant to monitor adequate resources at this time. So what are some of the issues that we are seeing? Some of the psychiatrists that are already working around this issue have reported that stigma is a big issue in terms of people who've tested positive, returning to work have faced a lot of stigma. People are fearful that you might infect me, which of course we can say it's because of not enough knowledge. Social isolation, some people, yes, they're in such social isolation to try and make sure that they respect the guidelines, but then people don't want to interact, or people forget, about other core staff members who are on social isolation. And also anxiety and depression has come up, but also there's a whole new issues reported on substance use, overuse, and also abuse as means of trying to deal with the situation. So just a note on stigma, that some of the things that we could use or that could be helpful to reduce stigma is we should not be referring people with the disease as COVID-19 cases, as COVID-19 victims, COVID-19 families. But then we may refer to them as people who have COVID-19, people who are being treated for COVID-19, or people who are recovering from that. Because when people have recovered from this, their lives will go on as normal, and if we've given them the stigma, we don't want them to continue with the stigma throughout. And some of the key focus areas and actions that could be looked into at an organizational level is that we need to be organized at an organizational level and communicate the business continuity plan. Like we said, there might be some changes that are implemented, so this needs to be communicated. And employees who have previously been identified as at risk for any social or mental health issue, this is the time that we need to be sure that we follow up and we know what is happening with them. All staff working remotely, in isolation, in quarantine, we need not forget about them, but we need to constantly update them, what are the changes, so that we minimize anxiety. Also of importance, we need to support our leaders and also train them on handling this unique situation. Remember, even our leaders have never been in this situation. So as they lead, it's even more frustrating as they lead while we still don't know what is happening. So as individuals, there are few areas that we need to keep on tapping on. We need to keep informed from reputable media outlets and authorities. And also those who are in mandatory isolation or self-isolation, encourage them that they need to maintain their social connectedness, be it cell phones, via videos and so forth. Let us try and exercise daily and also practice some mindfulness, meditation or prayer and so forth each day. And what is very important is that people, we need to remember, whoever is dealing with or having issues, remember that you are not alone. There is support out there. So if you're a health worker in the Department of Health, these are the contact people in your respective regions that have been identified and are available to assist with any mental health issues, especially for health workers in the country. In any other workplace other than Department of Health, we know we've got EAP services, and we know some of these EAP services have mainly dealt with alcohol or substance use, but we should inquire if they can be scaled up at this time to also include COVID-19 psychosocial issues. We know there's also a South African Depression and Anxiety Group, which has actually advised that they provide free telephonic counseling and information. They've got nationwide referral support groups and networks, and they also offer online resources. And there's been a group of 14 private and public psychiatrists in South Africa and psychologists, specifically in the Gauteng area, working with the South African Society of Psychiatrists. They've actually formed a team to help get support for healthcare workers in the Gauteng region. If you need a webinar, there was a webinar they conducted at the NIH, it's on the NIH website. And of very importance that they offer 4 confidential pro bono sessions for healthcare workers, and their approach is two-pronged. They initially assist leaders, managers, and healthcare settings employees with a preventive mental health care approach. But also, when anything is identified, they link that individual healthcare worker with a volunteer mental health care provider regionally. But while this is still only in Gauteng, I'd like to bring attention to that the South African Society of Psychiatrists will replicate this nationally. So it's very important that you check in your area what exists if you're not really within like a Gauteng area. And of very importance that much as I've said we are dealing with this for the first time, people will need to remember we are all in this together. So the better we come together to gain resources, the more we're going to emerge out of this strong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mpumi. That was Dr. Mpumi Ndaba from our occupational medicine section dealing with the mental health component. And it's critical that we need to consider what is required in our workplaces to support each other, to support our fellow employees, to support the management roles that are being played in this difficult time. And I think health and wellness and the employee assistance programs are critical in this case. Whilst Glenn is preparing the presentation for the slides for our next presentation, thanks Glenn, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Samantha Yalo. She is going to deal with the compensation issues related to COVID-19. Thank you, Samantha.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Samantha Ailu, and I will be presenting on compensation issues. All right, so first and foremost, we start off with our legislation, most importantly being our overarching Occupational Health and Safety Act. Then we have our hazardous biological agents, of which our SARS-CoV-2 is part of our Group 4, followed by our COID Act. And then we have our new Notice on Compensation for Occupationally Acquired Novel Coronavirus Disease under our COID Act, and we're going to be talking a lot about this today. So how do we make our diagnosis for occupationally acquired COVID-19? So first and foremost, we require a reliable diagnosis for COVID-19. So this really, we require a reverse transcriptase PCR diagnosis from a laboratory. So in the future, people are going to be doing rapid tests. But that even if we have a positive rapid test, we still require a positive PCR a positive reverse transcriptase PCR test. And then we also require a temporal association between exposure and symptoms. So this means that first we require an exposure followed by symptoms. So we can't obviously have our symptoms first and then the exposure. So those two are a definite must. And then thereafter, once we have this diagnosis and we have the temporal association, then we require either a high-risk COVID-19 work environment or occupational exposure to a known source of COVID-19 or an approved official trip and travel history to a high-risk area. But we're going to talk more about that. So who is able to claim for occupationally acquired COVID-19? So all workers with a valid contract are able to claim, except for domestic workers and those in informal trade. So our domestic workers and those in informal trade are unfortunately unable to claim, but if they, for instance, do have an occupational disease, they can claim through civil. They can open a civil case, and then they can claim through those means. Then our South African National Defence Force and our South African Police Service, our military staff as well. So those three entities, they unfortunately cannot claim through COID, but they have their own compensation fund through which they claim. So very importantly, because they are now very active and they probably have a lot of exposure, at this time, being essential staff. And then independent contractors, because they do not have a valid contract with anybody, so unfortunately also cannot claim through COID. But once again, if they do contract the virus, they once again can institute a claim, especially for whoever they work, especially if they find that whoever they have a contract with has been negligent. So they can institute a claim in the court of law. Then workers who work outside the country for more than 12 months and any act of willful misconduct leading to the disease. So the occupations at risk for COVID-19, according to the Department of Employment and Labour, so there are 4 groups: the very high and high risk exposure risk occupations. These are essentially our high risk, our health worker group, and they're just differentiated according to whether you do aerosol generating procedures, and they move from the very high risk category to the high risk category on whether they do aerosol generating procedures. So these are all our frontline health workers, dentists, lab staff. Then we have our medium exposure risk occupations, and these are our schools, people working in schools, our teachers, our lab, people who work in labor centers, in retail, construction sites, banks, or mines. And these people have frequent or close contact within 2 meters of possible COVID-19 patients. Then our low exposure risk occupations are jobs that do not require contact with people known to be suspected of being infected with COVID-19. So these occupations at risk of COVID-19 are very important because they are half the story as to whether people will be defined as occupationally acquired COVID-19. So for instance, our very high and high exposure risk groups, if anybody is a health worker, they are basically automatically defined as occupationally acquired because they are very high, they are high risk exposure for developing COVID. So they, the compensation commissioner will regard them as high risk for developing COVID. So it's really your medium exposure risk occupations and your low exposure risk occupations that will require motivation as to why the OMP thinks that they are occupationally acquired disease. So what makes this COVID-19 occupationally acquired? So like we said, the high risk occupations for COVID-19, that's really what makes you occupationally acquired. Travel for work purposes to a high risk country, that's quite important. Proof of close contact exposure within the work environment. And then other considerations would be a high density work environment, frequent contact, frequent touch, if your work requires frequent touch or frequent money exchange, or if it's a poor ventilation, there's poor ventilation in your work environment, or if you are a vulnerable group. That is, if you're older than 60, if you have chronic diseases, any risk factors that put you at a higher risk for COVID-19. And another, another thing that puts you at higher risk, or that the compensation commissioner would look at, is the balance of probabilities. And basically this states that you only need to be 51% sure that COVID-19 was occupationally acquired. So it doesn't really need to be beyond a reasonable doubt that it was occupationally acquired. So your OMP needs to provide good motivation that it was occupationally acquired. So like we said, your high risk group, it's basically taken for granted that it was occupationally acquired. Your medium risk group, yes, it's also a good, it's a good risk that it was occupationally acquired, but you have to provide motivation. But it's really this low risk occupations that really needs to give a lot of motivation as to why you think that it is occupationally acquired, because we need to take factors into a consideration. So we need to remember that you need to provide proof. So we need to, if you say that occupationally acquired, or if the OMP says it's occupationally acquired, then he needs to say why he thinks so. So he needs to provide proof as to the incubation period. What does the worker say? When was the date of the exact date of the symptoms? Give the incubation period, the contact, and we need to remember also the definition of a contact. The definition of a contact is 15 minutes of contact, 15 minutes of contact with the person within a meter of the person. So that's something important to remember. And something also to remember about the balance of probabilities is that we have no comparison. So with the COID Act, is that we have no comparison to a similar disease. Remember, this is a novel disease, a novel coronavirus. We don't know what's going to happen with the economy, the payouts, and how it's going to affect businesses. So we don't know how the compensation commissioner is going to react. So that's something to also consider, is we don't know how the compensation commissioner is going to react, or if he's going to accept these claims or repudiate these claims. So we really don't have a basis of how he's going to react to these claims. So moving on to assessment of impairment and benefits. Impairment is, so how they assess impairment? Assessment is made once a person reaches maximal medical improvement. And the degree of impairment is based on complications from the affected body system. So benefits are based on the benefits that you get, whether it's temporary total disablement, if payment and temporary total disablement, self-quarantine. Here the employer is liable for the days of leave. You also get permanent disablement, and here you either get a pension payout if you have more than 30% disablement, or you get a lump sum payment if you have less than 30% disablement. You also get a medical aid benefit, and you also get a death benefit. So reporting, the following documents should be submitted to the compensation commissioner. You have an employer report of an occupational disease on the WCL1 form, a notice of an occupational disease and claim for compensation form on a WCL14 form, exposure and medical questionnaire. I'll show you what that looks like just now. A first medical report in respect of an occupational disease on a WCL22 form, and exposure history and other employment history form on a WCL110 form, and a medical report from a doctor and or specialist. And that all goes together, and you submit that within 14 days of a diagnosis. And then, depending on how long your progress takes, or whether you have any sequelae or resulting difficulties, you may require lots of progress reports, and that you fill out in a WCL26 form. And then finally, you once you reach your MMI, your maximum medical improvement, you fill out a final medical report, also on a WCL26. Yes. So some important considerations. So when you fill out your first medical report, you should list the diagnosis as U07.1, and that's the ICD-10 code for COVID-19. It's important that your that an appropriate exposure history is documented. And that is, you must note things like, ventilation, risk factors for COVID-19, and that includes things like ventilation, if there's a high crowd setting, frequent money exchange, high touch environment, frequent customer interface, things like that. In your medical report, you need to also note important things. Your occupational history is also very important. Your examination findings, your risk factors are also very important. Your diagnosis, your lab results, and important special investigations. An affidavit by the employee is important if the employer cannot be traced, or sometimes the employer does not want to fill out the form. The employer is legally obliged to fill out the form, even if he thinks that it's not that the disease is not occupationally acquired. It's for the compensation commissioner to decide if it's occupationally acquired or not. So the forms are submitted online. It can be submitted online or manual. So I just jotted down I wrote on here the online and the manual process. So you can just follow, it's also on the notice, so you can just follow the processes here. So Rand Mutual deals with the miners' compensation, and FEM deals with the construction industry. It's the mutual assurance. So you can just follow the process here. So this, I told you we'll get back to it. This is the COVID-19 exposure medical questionnaire. So this must accompany all the COVID documents. So just fill in all the details as required, but this goes with all this must be filled in with all the documents sent initially. So those are my acknowledgements, and this is our NIOH Workplace Hotline. And yes, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Samantha. That was the section dealing with compensation issues. I'm going to ask, Graham, what's our time? Our colleagues to join us. Okay, so I'm going to ask my colleagues to join us now for the Q&A session. You have been posting your questions in the chat box and in the Q&A folder. So I'm going to ask Dr. Pumi Ndaba, Dr. Dick Volming, and again, Dr. Samantha Yagu, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing her surname properly, to join us, and for us to have the question and answer session. Now, just for those who may need to leave at a certain point, we have scheduled the session to run until 12 o'clock today. However, we've secured permission from the NIH leadership to continue a little while longer. So those of you who do have the extra time to stay with us after 12 o'clock, please do so. For those who are forced to leave around 12, we will be posting the questions also on the website in the FAQ or frequently asked questions section. And if you need to follow up with us, please use info@nioh.ac.za, info at nioh.ac.za if you've got any follow-up questions with regard to today's session. As posted already in our chat box, the video for Tuesday as well as the presentations for the first session, this is a repeat session, is already on the website and on YouTube. I've sent you the links in the chat box. If you scroll up in the chat box, you will see that I've posted the links there. So, okay, I'm going to ask our colleague, Simpiwe, just to make that Word document larger, and so that we can see the full length of the questions, and to scroll up to the first questions at the top for us, so we can commence with that. So, with regard to those who require the CPD points, the continuous professional development points, for the Health Professional Council South Africa, the South African Dental Association, I think SADA, SIO for Occupational Hygiene, and SIOSH for the General Occupational Health and Safety Management and Training practitioners. Please don't forget to add your professional number for us in the chat box. We are negotiating for the environmental health practitioners as well as the occupational health nursing practitioners to be also recognized as CPD points. We will make an announcement due date. So on my far right, I think your far left, if you look at the screen, is Dr. Turmi Dava from the Occupational Medicine section of the NIH. Next to us, a colleague from Occupation, well, in fact, all three are from Occupational Medicine. And next to her is Dr. Dave Valming, and then again, Dr. Samantha Yarvig, just on my immediate right-hand side. So let's look at that first question. We're not going to bother with regard to website questions, Superior. I think we've already indicated to them where. There's a question with regard to cleaning with soap and detergent and water. Does it kill the virus? How can hand washing with soap and water kill the virus? This is to query based on the presentation that was shown. So we can cover that question. I know we're encouraging hand washing with water and soap, and we're encouraging, where that's not available, the use of the alcohol-based hand sanitizer. How does that, in fact, deal with this particular virus? Odette?
I think it's an interesting query, and a lot of these queries just please, we have an expert here. So we've got that.
I'm welcoming. Yes.
I do need to plug the camera. But anyways, the SARS coronavirus 2 that we are dealing with has a lipid envelope. And when you use soap, the soap dissolves or kind of inactivates that membrane, damages the membrane, and that makes the whole virus inactive. So very much like we have our fatty layers on our plates when we're doing our dishwashing, the soap that we use, it easily takes off the fatty layer. So in the same way with the SARS virus, that membrane is damaged, destabilized by soap, and therefore it's very effective. So hand washing with soap and water, absolutely effective.
Thank you for that. And that was Dr. Tanisha Singh, the head of our COVID-19 algorithm response team, coming quickly to our rescue. The next question is dealing with, is it safe to see all the personal information? Well, okay, that's CPD points. Can we move on? Yeah. On that point, I have specifically asked our participants not to put it in the chat box for all the attendees, and only send it to us as the panelists. Unfortunately, some of the colleagues have still put it into the attendees. And that was the reference to the POPI Act. Okay. What is myalgia and malaise?
I think that came to my slide.
Yes. Okay.
Myalgia, those were when we were talking about the symptoms that we present with COVID-19. Myalgia is more when you have generalized, before flu-like illness, where you have generalized body pains, muscle pains. And malaise is sort of a tiredness. It's more a symptom of tiredness and fatigue. That's what.
Yeah. And Google. Okay. So can temperature be measured with an ear thermometer or an old digital thermometer, and then to be cleaned and sterilized afterwards? Disinfecting process for these thermometers, how accurate is the non-contact thermometer that is being imported now?
Okay, I'll answer that.
Samantha?
Right. So ideally, we prefer a non-contact infrared thermometer. And the best kind of non-contact infrared thermometer is really the scanning or the camera thermometer rather than the infrared skin thermometers. Those are the most accurate thermometers, but they're also the most expensive thermometers. So that's why we see the skin thermometers that most people use. but they're also quite inaccurate because they depend on the ambient room temperature, the way people take them, and the distance, and they depend on the device, and a lot of things like that. So we always say use the user manual. They need to be used in perfect, the perfect case scenarios. So you need to take the room temperature. So you need to read the instructions and things like that. Yeah. So you can't use 38 degrees. You need to use them at 37.3 degrees. Things like that. The ear thermometer, yes, you can use them, but they need to be properly disinfected. We don't recommend using them because the proper disinfection method needs to be followed. And you know, if you have to go through using them for a lot of people, then I suppose it's not ideal. So yeah, we don't really recommend them. The non-contact thermometers are better if you follow the right process.
Thank you, Samantha. So the next question is it necessary as an employer to do an analysis of employees where family members are clinically vulnerable?
Is it necessary is a very difficult question to answer in that, you know, is it necessary, do you mean is that legislated? It may not be legislated, but as different companies have done differently according to what resources they had available. In some healthcare hospital situations where healthcare workers lived with an old, frailing mom who was diabetic and had severe immunocompromised conditions and were maybe located or working from an isolation ward that deals with COVID-19 patients and treats them, or an ICU setting. In some cases, hospitals have looked at accommodating these people who were concerned about the risk that they're carrying home to their family members. But this kind of, is it necessary? It kind of depends on the employer, what means they have, and if it is reasonable to provide it. So it's not legislated, it's legislated for the employee. If the employee may have conditions that make them an increased risk of severe outcomes, we need to address their fitness for work if they're going into a high-risk situation.
Thank you, Odette. The next question is, when sending an employee on sick leave for 14 days for self-isolation after showing symptoms at work and reporting on the WCL2, surely the employee also need to visit the hospital to be seen by a doctor for the first medical progress and final medical reports. I guess that's kind of directed at you, Samantha, around compensation.
Yes. So they're asking, surely the employee needs to
sick leave. Now, if somebody is exposed, you know, in the workplace, they're not necessarily a claim yet, right? When you're exposed in the workplace, you then need to have a period of isolation and you need to monitor for symptoms. You monitor those 14 days for symptoms to see whether or not this person is a potential case. So at that point, if they do present with symptoms during those 14 days, then we need to relook at, we need to consider them for testing. If they are a positive case, after an exposure, they become positive. That is when they then need to follow the process of compensation. And then first medical reports and all those reporting structures need to be followed. But prior to them, at the point of exposure is not a case, and that is not compensable. The possible compensation part with regards to occupationally acquired infection would be when the employee who's at high risk does test positive. So at that point, they would have seen a medical practitioner. They would have they would have had to have a test. They would have to have confirmation that they were positive.
So if they develop symptoms, and right now they're just in quarantine, so you see if they're going to develop symptoms, yes, Thank you, Odette.
Okay.
But also,
Yes, go ahead.
it's important that when we're communicating this message to our fellow workers and employees in our organizations, that we stress that our compensation system, it's based on impairment. So yes, we are reporting to say this person has been infected at work and so forth, but it does not necessarily mean that we've done all the reporting, therefore money should come back. Compensation is based on impairment. So there will be assessment of how impaired they will be. So if they are not impaired or there's no evidence that they got impaired, maybe they just got the infection and they got cured or healed from that, then we're reporting that they had occupational exposure to this and so forth. But it's also not the employer. The employer can report, but no one can decide on whether you get compensated or not. That is the compensation commissioner. As the employer, we do our bit and report everything. And because we cannot actually sit back and say, no, we don't think this needs to be reported. Everything needs to be reported if it's occupational.
A quick follow-up question before we go to the next one in the list. Is that occupational or exposure medical questionnaire available online? Is it on our website?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So Tanya, to get that follow-up question from you, yes, the question is on our website. Please go and explore. Do not rush through our website. You've got to spend at least 15 minutes there and explore all the components, and you find all the resources.
So the question is actually at the back of the notice. So you'll see the notice is actually on the website. So it's at the back of the notice.
It's a combined document, and you'll find it in the notice. Okay, so first aid provision. The ball valve must be added to first aid kits instead of CPR mouthpiece. Also consider face shields and sanitizers in kits. Failing this will expose the first aid attendants. That's a comment which sounds very useful. Any responses to that comment?
Thank you very much for bringing that to our attention. And yes, it is a comment. But I just want to say upfront that there's a whole lot of other workplace scenarios that we will not be able to mention specifically during our presentations. But the aim is that when we do this presentation, to take that back to a specific workplace and see what applies where. But thank you for bringing that on.
So the next question is dealing with the position paper from the South African Thoracic Society not to conduct lung functions during COVID-19 pandemic. Your opinion, please. Is this more about the aerosolizing procedures?
Yes, it's actually, I think from beginning of March, we've been having that question. And we've been answering this question broadly, that firstly, go back to look at how you do your lung function. Even if you say somebody, they can blow into some protective, barrier, but remember that only protects the machine. But in terms of how the procedure is done, remember there's a technician who is actually providing guidance, who is within close proximity to the person that is doing the test. So the coaching from the technician, but also the actual person doing the test, the blowing, there's so much that cannot be controlled. But also there's a whole lot of implications with regard to how sure can you be that you've cleaned the machine properly. So considering all these issues and factors that you need to take into consideration and giving the balance of the benefits and risks, that is why the issue has been, it would be better to actually use other clinical indicators where you need to rather than doing spirometry. And I think, yes, it's been put on hold, but also when we were saying at that time, we were saying like, let's give it 3 months because we're not sure. Just give it 3 months. And it's more of a, especially in the workplace, it's more of a, you do spirometry, not necessarily when somebody's acutely ill. It's not a therapeutic measure, it's more of a procedural, something that can be put on hold and use other measures where you can to try and decide on whatever you need to decide.
And in your dealing with these matters also in the workplaces, on the ground, where the ties are, when you get that engineering control in place, it could be a barrier of sorts that would be protecting both the worker or patient and the health worker assisting in that process. Please let us know, info@nih.ac.za, and any guidelines that you might want to share with us. We will share with you when we have that. So the next question is, if staff members was in contact with a COVID-19 positive person and is asymptomatic, can she continue working after 8 days of exposure?
Okay. I think I'd like to take that question. I think this one, if we could just hold it there, just kind of refers to one of the scenarios that we spoke of that came from the guidance document for essential health workers, one of their work management algorithms, which we need to try to tailor-make to our own workplace and our own situations. These are essential health workers that it was talking to, the guideline was talking to. So in a person who's COVID, who had contact with a COVID positive person, this was only in a high-risk scenarios, which were in very close contact with COVID patients, and there was a failure of the PPE, so they didn't have the adequate protection of a known positive patient. One of the requirements said, in terms of return to work, that in a resource limited, the minimum days, there should be 7 days, plus they should have a PCR negative test in order for us to put that. So we must look at the situations that it was talking to. So in resource limited, in a high risk situation, and in staff shortages, that's the minimum that could be thought of with a test that is negative. So we can't, otherwise I think we should go with the NICD protocols that says 14 days away from the workplace would be maybe sufficient. If they're asymptomatic after those 14 days, we've taken into account the whole incubation period, at least 97% positive. We are sure that those people are not going to be, bringing it back and maybe getting COVID and bringing it back into our lives. With as much as we have in terms of, we'd rather be cautious, unless we don't have to.
Thanks for that, Odette. With regard to the Compensation for Occupational Diseases Act, COIDA, how to determine COVID-19 infection cause while at work versus in public, are there specific questionnaire for this to be completed?
Okay, this is a question that comes up all the time, and I hope I was kind of clear in my presentation. I tried to change it and be a little bit more specific, but essentially, you need a few things to be in place. You need the diagnosis of your COVID, you need your temporality, then you need your high risk work environment. So firstly, if you're a healthcare worker, then it's a given. If you're not a healthcare worker, then you need a few things in place. So if you then either you need a history of travel to a high risk area, or you need a proof that you had contracted it from somebody within your work environment, or you need a balance of probability that you had basically contracted it within your work environment. So if you're not a high risk healthcare worker. So based on that, your OMP would motivate, write a motivation letter and send all your documents to the Compensation Commissioner, who will then make a ruling on whether it's occupationally acquired. So that's essentially how this works. It's ultimately up to the Compensation Commissioner to decide whether this is occupationally acquired or not. Only once all the documents are received and you have reached maximal medical improvement and the last document is sent to the Compensation Commissioner, will you know the outcome of whether this claim was accepted by the Compensation Commissioner whether it was repudiated or whether the Compensation Commission requires more information. So that's ultimately how this process works. The key factor is to include all the information, to fill in all the documents as comprehensive as possible, and to include all the information and to motivate as best you can.
Yes. Can I just add to say, remember in the workplace, like we've spoken about in this instance where you test positive and so forth, it's always recommended that you share with your workplace. And in any workplace, when an incident, now because it's going to be taken as an incident, when an incident has happened, there's a process that is called incident investigation, whereby your supervisor, your occupational health and safety rep will be there, and maybe if you are not there, somebody who does a similar job as you will have to be there to look at what happened. So that is a workplace process, and that is the process where you need now to tease out what is it that we think, the process was done before you actually say, yes, it's workplace or not workplace acquired, So look into all of those issues. But even before you get there, we know our duties, where we work. This is the time to start with those changes. Because if you work, let's say, you're cleaning a taxi rank and so forth, some measures should be in place so that you are aware, like the distance and so forth, so that we try and minimize those. But when it has happened, there's still room for incident investigation in the workplace to say, what happened? Do we know it's here? If we don't know, is there any way that could have been prevented? And moving forward to say, we're going to, so this is how we're going to prevent that. That incident investigation provides an opportunity to actually look, to tease out some of the possible workplace factors that maybe we're not aware of, or maybe people in the workplace were not aware of, but just to take the other person through. Because the same claim, even if you do get to complete the claim, it's going to be looked into by somebody who doesn't know your workplace. So that is where the detail comes in, because they ask for all this incident investigation, what really happened, and to give them the perspective.
I'd just like to also state that no workplace wants to have this claim against them. So workplaces need to make sure that their workplaces are in a state that does not allow that a compensation happens. So workplaces need to make sure that so that needs to be in place.
I think the importance of prevention,
yes,
because compensation is clearly dealing with after the fact. So thanks for that emphasis. The next question is dealing with the proximity of 2 meters of the patient to a fellow worker who may be suspected of being infected with SARS-CoV-2 and those performing the aerosolizing procedures. So let's get to the key question. The question is fabric masks, right? And so the question is, would fabric masks that comply with the guidelines be sufficient to issue to couriers? Now my sense is at the moment, there aren't any real occupational health guidelines applicable to fabric masks. The only masks that are actually being addressed are those that are the N95 masks for the use by frontline healthcare workers, and it's got a high factor of protection. And then the surgical masks. My sense is cloth masks are now being encouraged by the health authorities for public use and does not really protect you against.
I think that the medical N95 masks are sort of the masks that have been recommended for healthcare workers where they have high risk of exposure, which is protective against the coronavirus. Surgical masks are more punted for people who have who are symptomatic and would probably, the respiratory droplets to contain them. There's not too much scientific information on how protective fabric masks are, what type of fabric to be used, how many layers to be used. So it's difficult to give guidance without that evidence.
Yeah. So take care, please. Cloth masks are not being recommended by the National Institute for Occupational Health for use as a protective measure, last resort in the workplace, where there are the specific conditions as explained by Odette. Please follow that advice. And if you're unclear, info@nih.ac.za or our helpline number. Can we get a clear indication of what does frequently disinfect mean for frequently touched surfaces, please? So some of those frequently touched surfaces could be in the workplace, or could be in the taxi on the way to work. Who do I hand that over to? Kume?
Frequently, it's not trying to run away from being specific. It's difficult to be specific sitting at a central point. You still go to your workplace, do your risk assessment. I know we keep on saying this and people think it's a big term, but the risk assessment simply means you look around in your workplace, which areas are frequently touched and at what time. So I'll make an example of a door that we all use to get into the workplace. If that is the place that people are touching, and how long will it take the next person to touch there and all of that? Because remember, we are thinking of what's the likelihood of transmitting infection from the other person to the next. So it will depend what the frequently touched area is. And, for example, is it bathrooms, areas that we share a lot? Is it some of the touch places, like I said, the coffee stations and so forth? So it's going to be based on your risk assessment of what's the frequency for those areas in your workplace and what's the risk. And also remembering that there will be other control measures in place. So but when we say frequently, we mean now look at it as more frequent than you used to before.
I think to emphasize what we say is that you got to do your observations, observe the work processes, understand what people are doing and when the touching happens. So some cases, in the case of doors, maybe you could change the use of the door to ensure that you either completely eliminate people having to touch that handle. In our workplace here, some doors we now just push with our arms without having to touch any particular surfaces. But if it's completely unavoidable for people to touch certain surfaces, you've got to observe everybody in the workplaces, work procedures in order to determine which are those high touch areas and how often they need to be cleaned and whose responsibility is to clean. Our next question deals with guidelines for silver treated material masks. Like this balloon, we've covered the mask story that is not the prescribed ones. Again, that's the cloth mask. We're moving on. So what is your opinion with regard to the usefulness of spray booths at the entrances? And I would assume this is either the entrances of workplaces for workers and or clients, or perhaps entrances to workspaces. Have we had to look up the available evidence and research information on this, or can we come back on this question?
I think we also need to look at, what is harmful to health if we spray the skin, just because these are also substances that, 70% alcohol and that are irritants to our skin. And so, Annika speaks about how we need to look after our skin and nourish our skin and things like that. So we need to also think about not putting something in place that is harmful at the same time. Like, with latex gloves, there's always a risk of you put latex gloves on, but then you could develop an allergy from it. So you must also weigh, when we think about the controls that we're putting in place, we need to weigh up, as it also, could that control not also be harmful?
Just to clarify, what would be the chemical substance that's involved in the spray booths that you're concerned about?
Like even the 70% alcohol.
Okay.
And, yeah.
And I agree with Odette. And what are you trying to kill? Because what we are worried about is the hands, maybe the feet, or you're carrying the germs on your shoes. I mean, worried mostly about the hands, not really the hair or on your body. So I would think that it's really useful firsthand, unless what are you really spraying? Maybe
Yes.
Just, you know.
So what is the practical and effective measure guided by the risk assessment we've been reminding you about earlier that is going to follow the hierarchy of control measures and the hierarchy of containment? So you may want people to do the basic hygiene and ensure that additional PPE may be required, and it's clearly based on the risk assessment. We cannot encourage one-size-fits-all measures like spray boots, which could have both contact, inhalation, and other forms of problems. People may not be wearing glasses or goggles, and it might also come into contact with their eyes, etc. So, what does contact time mean? And I'm not sure if that question was with reference to cleaning and disinfecting. I think further on, people also try to ask the question, the difference between cleaning and disinfecting. We can cover that as well.
If it's on contact time, I wanted to say, I think that more for the cleaning, like presentation, that's the time. I think they said, like if you look at the processes, you sort of clean, this is now you remove the upper layer, and then the disinfection. I think that's where she spoke about the contact time, like how long should that have been there. So the contact time is the time at which after you apply a disinfectant, how long should the disinfectant be there, hoping to be in contact with, you know, the virus. So in this context, the virus. So, you know, different disinfectants have different detergents have different time frames. They say you need to apply, let's say, maybe the jig or whatsoever for this time before you sort of wipe again, or it should be on contact with that, you know, virus or with that surface for so long before you wipe it off. So I think that was the contact time used in the context of the cleaning and disinfection.
And I think on our website, in our presentations, there are very clear guidelines, articles as well, with regard to the type of surfaces, apologies, that this particular virus can land on and how long it could possibly last. We don't want to wait. I think we need that frequent cleaning and disinfecting procedures, because we're not busy at work with our own lab experiments with regard to how long the virus could last. So let's do the proper cleaning based on your risk assessment. We covered that question. Okay. What disinfection can be used on carpets? That's a very interesting one. That's covered in Anita's presentation, no? Yeah. And we can respond to that also via the frequently asked questions. What is the best disinfectant for the use for linen fabrics? That's very interesting. I guess linen fabrics, based on current standard infection and prevention control measures, procedures and protocols, which is being handled in the categories that it is dealt with, right? The low, medium, and high risk type of contaminated materials. And this is probably a hospital or a frail care facility, okay?
To tell you the truth, I don't know what the best disinfection
Soap and water in the washing machine?
Maybe temperature, so it does depend. And you know, certain laundries, hospital laundries, would have specific places where they would put the more hazardous ones, and they would have to follow the procedures accordingly. So I'm not able to answer that in terms of that specific.
Very key. The risk assessment for the specific health facility will guide who and what procedures are involved and who might be exposed. Again, we can't give you a generic answer today on that. If you want to follow up on that, please get in touch with us by info@minimise.ac.za. The very last question, because we've reached the extended time for our session, the end of that almost. There seems to be some contribution. I think we've covered that, cleaning and infection. How do we deal with the officials who purposefully share anxiety-inducing information amongst officials who intentionally increase stress on others in the workplace? I think this is a mental health question. Is this reason enough to send such an official for counseling and assistance to understand the disruptive behavior on a team at large, considering this person may be at an entry level of management within the team? Sounds like a very detailed question, sounds like a very real-life scenario.
And actually, just to start with, part of the preparedness, as people will be coming back or people are already at work, it's very important for your organization to actually say what will happen. You know, how it's going to deal with people who are found to be disruptive and sharing anxiety-inducing information. But also, before actually we get to the punitive side of it, just make people aware what it does, because some people, maybe they put it the way where they're gaining attention and whatsoever. So maybe the first part is just to share with them what it does to other people and how it sort of undermines some of the systems that are in place and how it disrupts, the optimum functionality of other people. So that is part of health promotion, why we don't recommend this. But should you be found to be doing that kind of behavior, then because it's undermining systems in place, this is how we are going to deal with this situation. And I believe people are aware of the instance in KZN where one employee, or I think for a particular organization, was found to be sharing side. Because sometimes people get joy from being the center of the limelight at the time. But it's very important for organizations to state that upfront and actually extend, as the writer actually mentioned, you need to extend to this person that are they sure, do they need, do they benefit from a session, counseling session or something like that.
So the employee assistance programs will have to play a key role here. Keeping in mind that all of these systems need to be reviewed based on your new COVID-19 risk assessment that every workplace needs to undertake. So with great pride, I share with my colleagues on the panel the many thanks that have been registered in our chat box for excellent presentations and many other complimentary comments that are there. So I would need to thank Dr. Mpumi Ndaba, Dr. Dick Volnik, and Dr. Samantha Yalu on their presentations and contributions. They will glance through all of your congratulatory and thanks that you've offered in the chat box. Just a reminder, on our website and as well as in the invitation you received is our contact details for both our hotline, our email address, our Twitter account, and then there is the links to the resources, many resources in the on the NIH website, and referrals to other resources. But keeping in mind also that we have all of the videos on the YouTube channel. So for those who needed the CPD points, I'm hoping that before we close the session, before Greg clicks close, that you had placed your professional registration number for either the HPCSA, for SADA, for SIO, for SIOSH, and we will be working on the nursing and environmental health practitioners. So on that point, I want to say thank you very much. All those questions not dealt with during our panel discussion, our panel session now will be added to the frequently asked questions on our website. Odette will make a final comment and announcement.
Sorry to interrupt you, Asha.
No.
I just wanted to let everybody know that we are hoping to plan a session only on questions and answers. Because we know that oftentimes our presentations go on a little bit too long, and then there's such limited time for this, and this is where people really need the information. So please watch the space, watch our website. We are planning for that. It also needs to take into account what our president says this evening and what's going to happen with the lockdown. To see what kind of issues are going to come up and that needs to be addressed so that we can have an open forum for talking about what are frequently asked questions and allowing for people to ask the session of asking questions in the workplace. Also, there's our hotline that comes to the occupational medicine department that is available there, and it's 0800 212 132. We try to give you an immediate answer where we can. If we can't, we have your phone number and your details so that we can respond to you when we do get the answers. So please utilize those services.
Thank you, Odette. And those resources and services and links that Odette has just referred to has been put together by a lot of hard-working colleagues here at the National Institute for Occupational Health. In particular, our IT team, lots of admin people, and the head and his colleagues in the corporate services. So on behalf of the team here, including people you can't see behind the camera, we say thanks a lot to our head of the outbreak response team, Dr. Tanusha Singh, but particularly our executive director, Dr. Spokhala Mono, for making it possible that we can reach you with all this very information. So at this point, again, a session that has reached 1,000 maximum logins that we can have. We say thank you very much for joining us here today. We will see you. Rumor has it we may have that panel question and answer session probably on Tuesday. But watch the space. We will send you an invite via email and our other platforms. Thank you and goodbye.